Hi everyone, I'm Katrina LOLICATO. I'm conducting research in partnership with COAS's Culture, Heritage and Language Department and through Deakin University as part of my PhD research. So today I would actually really like to pick up where Elizabeth has just left off, as well as picking up on some of the discussion points that were raised yesterday after lunch in the Museums and Heritage session as well. And I would like to do this by looking at the questions raised and the responsibilities for museums when it comes to the potential for exhibitions and ethnocultural museums in general to present the histories and contemporary cultures of their communities, of course. I'd like to do this by introducing my own research that I'm currently undertaking, and I would like to also attempt to reorientate the direction from where museums can enact the public good and social benefit that we so often talk about. So I'd like to share some of my thoughts and thinking throughs and where I think my research is taking me, and I'm looking forward to your feedback, particularly seeing as there are actually some people in the audience who have participated in my research, which is fantastic as well. So my research documents the normal multicultural experiences of museum employees. So these are the employees and volunteers, as well as the collaborators and partners that have come into the museum and who are currently working within this place. So I have been conducting interviews, forum discussions and surveys from within this group, and these modes of investigation seek to move beyond the documenting of cultural aesthetics, the traditions, the physical characteristics and signifiers of the Italian-Australian culture, and into what I see as being the next important discussion. I am asserting through my research that Italian-Australian, as representing a suite of varied social and historical experiences, offers a specific skill set that really surpasses the ability to confirm the success of multiculturalism. I also claim that discursive technologies of governance may not be as invisible as we think to those who feel the limitations of that structure. So here my overarching objective is to identify the opportunities for the Italian-Australian experience to meaningfully underwrite Australian history and political discussion. This requires a break from the traditional use of ethnic museums as places that demonstrate the success of multicultural policy, and implies a move towards the productive intercultural dialogue, by which I mean Italian, Australian and Australian, but also within our own. One of the major lessons that I've learnt in this research is that there is beyond enough discourse within our own community for a starting point for a cosmopolitan discussion. So that's what I mean by intercultural. So the Italian-Australian experience is advantageously positioned to explore and communicate broader perspectives around themes relating to becoming and being Australian. So I'm going to situate my discussion a little bit. We're all very familiar. 1973, A Multicultural Society for the Future was released, displacing monocultural, integrative and assimilation ideals. It promised to unify Australians. But how? The answer appears to have been through the policy itself. Australians were now compelled to think of their home in a different light, in contradiction to all previous policy, sanctioned attitudes spanning back to terra nullius. Australians were expected to share their landscape, and it was their landscape. And we were multicultural because evidently we were multicultural now. While the author of the report, Al Gaspy, had a clear view that multiculturalism just defined what was already happening, the new policy instantaneously changed the everyday rhetoric, creating a legacy from where museum audiences and workers alike formulate the basis for understanding what culture, identity and community are supposed to look like. The vocabulary and tone with which policy is imbued is taken up by organisations and citizens. First through tolerance, then celebration of difference, and now diversity, the language we have come to associate with multiculturalism directs our attitude towards others. Words like celebrate, diversity, contribute, WOG, and phrases like cultural identity, for a better life, and Australian character have provided a concise multicultural vocabulary from where discussion, critique and debate are directed, and from where good and bad multicultural behaviour is measured. We have also, within our own Italian Australianness, have developed a counter vocabulary from within. So words like real Italian, proper Italian with reference to language, Anglo, Aussie, again, WOG, being a half of something, a bitza, a mix, allows for a comparative ethnic and cultural identification and indicates the amount of Italianness or Australianness one has accumulated. These words denote our relationships to each other and to the nation states of both Italy and Australia. As a constructed good, media outlets, workplaces and all levels of educational institutions apply vigorous and obvious expressions of multicultural policy within their own corporate structure. The deliberate use of this language in the desire to be seen to be doing the right thing by Australia's multicultural nationalism makes the policy visible in the everyday. Its specific and well-repeated vocabulary anchors the values of the ideology itself. But what does this do? So, in short, what I'm thinking is its repeated use creates a structure that eventually begins to feel so natural that to most, making fault lines almost invisible. So, in 1975, again at the beginning of Australia's multicultural history, the Whitlam government's Pishett report on Australian museums was released. As well as being directly responsible for the enactment of the Museum of Australia Act in 1980, it outlined the challenges for museums into the 21st century. Remember, this is 1975, so. Issues around governance, funding and collection management, as well as the potential for learning in the museum were all presented. But perhaps the most compelling statement very early in the report is that the Committee of Inquiry on Museums and National Collections attempts to define the museum. And one gets the feeling that the language used in this report is as much aimed at inspiring museums as it is making government recommendations. So it's a long shopping list. So the report compels museums to classify and arrange their exhibits with boldness and caution, conscious of the way of arranging knowledge that can be illuminating in one era and stultifying in another, to satisfy and arouse curiosity, to educate formally and informally, to extend the front lines of knowledge and enable curious spectators to visit those front lines and understand how some of the battles to extend that knowledge are fought. It goes on. To give play to the magic provided by the rare and unique object, be both art form and theatre, attempting to improve the quality and variety of messages, and finally it should entertain people of all ages. So it's quite a shopping list. Obvious parallels to the tenet of new museology and the desire to frame museums as potential contact zones, as well as a reference to audiences as consumers, can be observed within this list of tasks. It is interesting that in 1975, the report also states, museums would enhance their educational value if from time to time they set out displays showing both sides of unresolved issues. Continental drift, it uses as its example, was more suited to a museum display when the concept was hearsay than it is today. The concept is widely favoured. So, museums would become more influential if they displayed controversies or issues of uncertainty. Further to this, the report indicates the function of the exhibition must change with the social and educational needs of the people it serves, not as we have come to think, the other way around. In recent years, the quest has been to teach audiences about an idealised version of us. Discourse has focused on how to include, how to teach, how to tell the right stories, how to get them, the audience, to see who we are, and so that they get that message. Early on, those who had a hand in the creation and the direction of that same report, through contributions to the 1989 Agenda for the Multicultural Australia, were also engaged in practising the new museology with a focus on reflexivity. Those curators were still actively grappling with the definitions and the interpretations of multiculturalism, community and culture more generally. When the policy transitioned to our natural state, critical inquiry gave well to an acceptance, and in many cases the use of themes around migration and migrants as unquestionable, celebratory and folkloric interpretations that functioned to reinforce national identity rather than to discuss or created. The Nation of Immigrants narrative is attractive to those who seek to unite diverse elements within the nation. But in many cases, it has been stripped of its early radical and rebellious origins, and the story is devoid of crucial social and political context. While within museums, multiculturalism is in danger of becoming our generation's continental drift. The current critical discourse is indicative of the flow of academic interest pointing to the issues around the tendency towards ethnic compartmentalisation and the formation of discursive structures that have acted in contradiction to the official recognition of the benefits of multiculturalism. It seems that in light of this, we should be asking ourselves, what do audiences need to learn and what do we need to change? Most often, impact and emancipative effect are measured by the ability for museums to change the minds of the outsider visitor. What is perplexing to me is that this usual tack tends to neglect the individual roles played by people working within museums in creating, altering and operating the institution itself. It fails to acknowledge that there is a community operating within the museum and that this community also operates in other social fields, encountering everyday multiculturalism. There is the potential for those people to bring into the institution insight that might be useful in changing how the institution deals with this discourse. Ethnocultural museums can be examples and forerunners for new multicultural discussion. How am I going? I seek to pause momentarily from the production of the exhibition and the focus on outsider audiences to explore the potential for ethnocultural community museums to move towards a mode of thinking that addresses Australia's future cultural state. This is where interculturality is actually embodied by citizens through either multi-ethnic backgrounds or through several generations of Australian settlement. The overarching objective is to bridge the questions, what is culture and what is the point of culture? And so I am investigating the meaning of multicultural via the words we in Australia most commonly use to describe and subscribe meaning to. In reorientating this idea of social benefit and public good away from these external audiences, I don't wish to minimise the relevance of continuing to engage in research that gauges these audience responsiveness. I am, however, asking to suspend those goals just for a moment so I can focus on other issues at hand. Namely, the desire from within the community of thinkers generating the discourse to shift the structure from within which they operate, and the burgeoning new multicultural reality for those who are deemed to be multicultural. In a manner similar to how within British cultural studies, Raymond Williams shifted the definition of culture from elite to normal, and Stuart Hall of ethnicity as innate to politically constructed, ethnocultural museums have the potential to benefit their own field by antagonising the structure and questioning its validity from within. Rather than accepting the dominant voice and objectifying diaspora as a realm of study, Stuart Hall maintained his positioning within the phenomenon, using his perspective to interrupt the discourse. Diasporic thinking then becomes an approach to critical thinking. The everyday interactions and encounters that affirm difference also provide a heightened ability to identify the markers that define that difference. Multiculturalism as an overt, ubiquitous and often discussed system through which we in Australia define national identity, but also individuals and their practice, is palpable to those, as I said, who identify within that structure. The interviews and discussions that I have conducted to date has revealed several points from where the Italian-Australian critical perspective might be engaged. So being a liked other, I've found, in Australia, doesn't make you part of the mainstream. While Italian-Australians no longer experience daily, direct, overt negative media input, declaring them as the enemy within, my preliminary findings indicate that this does not mean that they do not feel the difference. Having been racialised and vilified in the past, it is possible to glean insight into the impact of historical ancestral experience and intergenerational memory of belonging. It is precisely because there is we are not currently a protagonist for media, politicians and other non-migration pressure groups in their argument against Australia's multicultural policy and migration rates, that we can quash the idea of multiculturalism as a debate. By extricating qualifications of contribution, enrichment and even mobility, often used to assess the worthiness of a group within Australian society, this study and the Museo, I think, can bypass the need to advocate for our group's Australian existence and instead take as premise our permanent position as stakeholders in this nation. Italian Australians provide a potential window into the future. In total defiance of the usual, ordinary, orderly homogeneity projected, Italian Australians are multi-ethnic. And previous research has indicated that intermarriage between those of Italian cultural background and others of all backgrounds in Australia is increasing. This establishes an impetus for this group, our group, to find ways of acknowledging the idea of new ethnicities. We then explore, through that idea of new ethnicities, Australia's future cultural state, one where interculturality is actually embodied by citizens, either through the multi-ethnic background or, as I stated, through several generations of Australian settlement. Multiple generations of settlement has also resulted in a variety of observable and so discussable cultural variations. Traditions have been modified, incorporated and lost. Historical knowledge filtered and physical contemporary connection to the Italian homeland distanced. However, the conditions of familiar relationships set against the backdrop of these processes has also generated an emerging cultural sentiments, cultural traits and a characteristic filled with its own tastes. Further to this, the new cohort of migrants who are on a completely different historical and political trajectory to us, they can engender a kind of control group who see the post-war cohort from the outside as well. They provide a perspective that is less caught in this multicultural bubble that we've all developed within. And their observations therefore provide valuable insight into political and social cultural affect. Finally, there is an existing and convincing awareness of the cultural signifiers and the characteristic nuances of this group. So the extensive body of knowledge concerning the recounting of an Italian Australian history, culture, identity has already been developed. Lucky me. So this affords a benefit for me and the Museo of not having to follow suit necessarily with descriptive analysis that attempts to define the unique culture we call Italian Australian. We can assume the presence of complexity, of fluidity and shades of grey present in any attempt to understand culture and extend that discussion beyond the what and the how and towards the so what and how is this important. So whether viewed as advantageous, frustrating or prohibiting, Italian Australians do not necessarily identify as being part of ordinary Australia. Their uniqueness extends beyond food, beyond music and tradition, towards distinct worldviews determined by cohort and generations since settlement. As with the question of where do you come from, what may appear munificent to some may for others serve as a reinforcement of a belonging less in Australia. Museo Italiano could potentially broker between its stakeholders and nationalistically driven established conventions of ethnic narrative management. In this sense, the museum's audience can become the structuring forces themselves, funding bodies, policy-making committees, government departments and other museums and cultural institutions. While all museums need to be attuned to how their communities are developing, in order to remain relevant and socially constructive, ethnocultural museums must also negotiate what is sometimes a contrary system of governance that tends towards privileging the status quo. But it is through this negotiation that we can push the boundaries of accepting multicultural discussion. Would you like me to finish there, Dan? Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
I think so, yeah. Thank you very much.